This episode of The History Guy is brought to you by Incogni. Ambrose Bierce is without a doubt one of the most celebrated authors in American history. Perhaps most famous is his short story An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, which famous author Kurt Vonnegut Jr. described as the greatest American short story of all time. But he was also a poet and a journalist, a writer of horror who is said to have inspired authors as diverse as H.P. Lovecraft and Ernest Hemmingway. And that fame makes it all the more mysterious that in 1913, Ambrose Bierce disappeared without a trace. You won't believe it, but yesterday I got a letter in the mail informing me of yet another data breach that lost my information. Now, more worrying and new passwords yet again. There are just so many ways to lose your information, and when it's taken, where does it go? Well, one place it goes is to data brokers, shady web pirates who collect and sell your data, things like your name, your home address, even your social security number, and your shopping habits, information that they then sell, putting your family, your finances, and your peace of mind at risk. But you do have protection because the law says that you have the right to request that these data brokers delete the information that they have on you and protect your privacy. But it's not easy to do. You have to know who to ask and how to ask. And if you do that by yourself, it can literally take years. And that's where Incogni comes in. And thank you, Incogni, for sponsoring this episode of The History Guy. Incogni helps you protect your privacy and take your personal data off the market by reaching out to data brokers on your behalf and requesting your personal data removal and dealing with their objections. I signed up for Incogni last September, and holy cow, they've completed 178 removal requests and saved me a whopping 133 hours of effort. And that's time that I could use for myself. And it's also peace of mind. And they keep looking out for me. Incogni lets me see how I'm doing on a really simple to use dashboard. So go to incogni.com/thehistoryguy and use the code thehistoryguy to get a screaming deal of 60% off an annual plan. That's incogni.com/thehistoryguy. Use the code thehistoryguy or click the link below and take your data off the market. In his 1929 biography of his friend, Walter Neal said of Ambrose Bierce, "Bierce told me that he was born on a farm in Western Reserve in Ohio, and there remained until he was about 17, when he tired from farm life and ran away from his home to Chicago." As to his penchant for writing, Neal writes that Bierce's father was a man of considerable scholarship and had been private secretary to Franklin Pierce when that gentleman was president. It is indicative of Bierce, however, that Neal found out later that the story that Bierce had told him was not completely true. In fact, he had never run away, but had relocated with his family to Indiana until he enlisted during the Civil War. It is interesting that Bierce had both a penchant for telling stories, even to his good friends, as well as, apparently, dreams of running away, something that would turn out to be ironic. Bierce's family was certainly interesting. The Elkhart, Indiana Daily Truth recalled in 1922 that Marcus Aurelius Bierce and his wife had 12 children, twin sons who had died in infancy, and the following uniquely named sons and daughters who grew to maturity: Abigail, Addison, Emilius, Aurelius, Anne, Augustus, Andrew, Alameda, Albert, and Ambrose. While the paper reports that time and wars and the things that happened to families scattered the Bierces, only one of the 10 earned fame. For the youngest of the sons, Ambrose, one-time Elkhartian, wrote some short stories that are listed among American classics. But few now living in Elkhart even know that one of the nation's finest writers played as a boy in the muddy streets of the antebellum village. Oddly, given both his father's education and his future fame, Bierce apparently did not receive much in terms of formal education. A childhood friend recalled in the Daily Truth that the boy had what was called a poor chance. He quit school early and went to work in the brickyards. But Bierce would grow to maturity during a tumultuous time. The paper continues. Then Fort Sumter was fired on, and Elkhart was aflame with patriotism. Young fellows enlisted faster than they could be equipped and mobilized, and young Bierce was among the very first. He joined Company C, the 9th Indiana Infantry. Then he gave his friends their first surprise. The Army seemed to bring out in young Ambrose things that had never been seen in Elkhart. His education had been neglected, and he was always rather queer and different. But the first thing I knew, he was a commissioned officer on the staff of General W.E. Gross in the Army of Cumberland. As a topographical engineer, Bierce served throughout the war with great distinction. Bierce's experience in the war was clearly important. Perhaps his most famous piece, the short story An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, is set during the war, as are many of his other stories. He served throughout the war in many of its bloodiest engagements, later writing a memoir of his experiences at the 1862 Battle of Shiloh. Enlisting as a private, by 1863 he had been promoted to first lieutenant and was a topographer working for Brigadier General William Hazen. Writing in a 1952 edition of the journal American Literature, Paul Fathout of Purdue University wondered how he acquired mastery in the craft of map-making is not clear, but he was apparently quite good at it, an indication of his intellect. He is frequently quoted as having said, "War is God's way of teaching Americans geography," although the attribution is questioned. Hazen recommended him for an appointment to West Point, a recommendation that was supported by General Sherman, but a wound prevented him accepting. Recovered from his wounds, Fathout writes that his competence as acting topographical officer on the staff of Hazen so pleased his exacting commander that in 1866 he invited Bierce to be engineering attaché to the Hazen expedition to inspect military posts from Omaha to San Francisco. He left the military upon arriving in San Francisco with the rank of brevet major, quite impressive for a farm boy with little formal schooling. There, Bierce took on another career for which he had no apparent formal training, but great talent. The website of the American Poetry Foundation writes, a talented critic and satirist, his poems and other works were published in numerous newspaper columns for over 40 years, beginning with the Californian. In 1868, he became the editor of the Newsletter, for which he wrote his famous Town Crier column. Bierce became something of a noted figure in California literary society, forming friendships with Mark Twain, Bret Harte, and Joaquin Miller. He was a muckraking journalist, often published in William Randolph Hearst's San Francisco Examiner. The Poetry Foundation writes that for his sardonic wit and damning observations on the personalities and events of the day, he became known as the wickedest man in San Francisco. But he was also a poet, an essayist, and a writer of short stories, including works of horror. Bailey Millard, a noted historian who wrote a first-hand account of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, said of his works of horror, "He wrote the most gruesome, the most harrowing, the most terrible tales ever published in this country." The Poetry Foundation writes that the classic Biercean narrative includes a marked use of black humor, particularly in the ironic and hideous deaths his protagonists often suffer. Writing in England for the magazine Fun, his dark wit earned him the nickname Bitter Bierce. Noted is his 1906 Devil's Dictionary, which the Foundation describes as a lexicon of its author's wit and animosity, in which Bierce vented much of his contempt for politics, religion, society, and conventional human values. Among the definitions is politics, a strife of interests masquerading as a contest of principles, the conduct of public affairs for private advantage. Some may find that still relevant today. Or one of my favorites, for obvious reasons. History is an account, mostly false, of events, mostly unimportant, which are brought about by rulers, mostly knaves, and soldiers, mostly fools. It is no surprise that the Foundation notes that Bierce acquired the public persona of an admired but often hated genius, a man of contradiction and mystery. Writing on the website bookstellyouwhy.com, author Ben Keefe notes that Bierce was sarcastic, brutally tasteless, and very good at not making friends. Keefe remarks, public opinion surrounding the man can be summed up in one fact. He carried a gun to ward off detractors. Still, the American Revolution Bicentennial Administration ranked the Devil's Dictionary among the 100 greatest masterpieces of American literature. Keefe writes that he was also a fantastic wordsmith. Millard notes that technically none could touch him. He corrected Kipling and even Howells. And in his critical essays, he showed where many other famous authors failed in their facts or in their diction. Such work made him a target for satire himself, with satirist Arthur McEwen posting that his initials A.G. Bierce stood for Almighty God Bierce. In 1914, Millard summed up his career. Bierce led a most remarkable life, half hermit, half bohemian, and altogether egotistical and cynical. In the West, he was the most hated and feared of writers, and the most courted and spoiled. He lampooned nearly everybody in political and private life with hair-raising audacity. As dean of the Pacific Coast Letter, he made and unmade authors and poets. The dilettante worshipped him. He has been called the American Swift, the last of the satirists, and the Maupassant of the West. He was an iconoclast of the first order. Millard, who wrote I Knew the Man Well, was writing in December of 1914, approximately a year since anyone had heard from Ambrose Bierce. The Oakland Tribune reported in October 1914. To give the full history of the strange disappearance of Bierce, it is first necessary to go back to his 71st birthday, which he celebrated with friends in Washington, D.C. last October. Shortly afterwards, he left Washington to make a tour of the southern battlefields where he had seen service as an engineer. In 1913 was commemorated the 50th anniversary of Chickamauga and other battles in which Major Bierce had taken part, and it was that fact which prompted him to make the tour. He did not intend to return to his home in Washington. In his characteristic fashion, he told friends that this damn country was not fit to live in, with prohibition and women voting. Instead, he said, he wanted to see a scrap before he died. His announced plan was to cross the border into Mexico. Mexico at the time was in the midst of civil war. Millard writes that when Villa rose against Huerta and the Constitutionalists, Bierce, who was a Northern captain in the Civil War and was a brevet major for exceptional gallantry, went to Mexico and joined the staff of the doughty general. It appears that Bierce had finally done what he claimed to have done at age 17 and run away from home. The Tribune writes that his plan was to make his way to the west coast, sail thence for the west coast of South America, cross the Andes to the east coast of South America, and then return home. The Tribune reports the last letter received from him reached the United States around the December holidays. It had been written in Chihuahua and had been delayed in transmission. In that last letter from Chihuahua, Bierce stated that he was in the saddle and on the move. "If you don't hear from me for some time, don't be alarmed," is the substance of one sentence this letter contained. So there was no alarm felt for some little time, but when a month, 2 months, 3 months passed and there came no word from him, his friends became greatly alarmed. Since that time there has been no word of Bierce. He vanished as completely as though the earth had swallowed him up. By 1914, his friends were certain of his death. The Tribune writes that those who knew Bierce best say that he would never have stayed in Mexico once he received news of the Great War in Europe. It was to see fighting that he went to Mexico, but his friends declared that he would never waste his time on the Mexican Revolution, when the most tremendous conflict of history waged in another theater. Millard wrote that his friends, united in saying that if he were alive, he would not have left them so long in suspense. There is so little doubt of his death that his friends and relatives have given up searching for him and mourn him as lost. Ironically, Bierce had included 3 stories under the heading Mysterious Disappearances in his 1893 collection of horror tales called Can Such Things Be? Like Bierce, the 3 protagonists disappear without a trace. Author Joe Nickell wrote in 1992, Bierce's own unsolved disappearance seems an altogether fitting end for a writer who was fascinated by mysterious disappearances. Exactly what happened to the famous author is still a mystery. The Anderson, Indiana Herald reported in September 1914 that an official inquiry into the disappearance in Mexico had been made by the Departments of State and War at the request of the Secretary of the Interior, but, quote, nothing has been heard. Many theories have arisen. In 1934, the Evansville, Indiana Journal reported that a soldier of fortune named Tex O'Reilly had fought in the war in Mexico and was familiar with the circumstances of Bierce's death, saying that Bierce had fallen in with bandits in a drinking bout. They became suspicious, lured him to a lonely spot, and pistoled him with his own 6-shooter. A retired priest named Jamie Linehart became so convinced of a story that Bierce had been executed by Villaists that he had a gravestone erected in the town of Sierra Mojada. Neal discounts these stories, as does Joe Nickell in his 1992 book Ambrose Bierce is Missing. Both authors note that a physical copy of the often reported letter from Chihuahua has never been located, and there's reason to suspect that it never existed. There is no compelling evidence that Bierce even entered Mexico. Nickell writes that the numerous stories that have arisen since are merely speculation. The perpetual stories of Mexicans who remember the quarrel between Villa and Bierce or Bierce's burial on the battlefield invariably peter out into uncertainties once investigated. If the number keeps increasing, as many Mexican towns will claim to have been the death place of Bierce, as Grecian towns claim to be the birthplace of Homer. In a 2002 edition of Harper's Magazine, author Jacob Silverstein notes a 1990 letter to the editor to the Marfa, Texas Sentinel, claiming that Bierce had died in Marfa on January 17, 1914. The story came via a Marfa resident who had picked up an old hitchhiker in 1957 who claimed that he had fought in the Mexican Civil War. He told the driver that they'd encountered an old man, quite sick from a cold, and escorted him to Texas, where U.S. troops confused him for a fleeing deserter from Mexico. He was taken to a camp where he died of pneumonia and was buried in a common grave. Silverstein was, however, unable to locate the cemetery where the body was supposed to have been buried. In April of 1915, the New York World reported the shocking news that Bierce had been found in France. The paper reported that a letter had been received by his daughter, and that Bierce had left Mexico, traveled to France, and was on the staff of Lord Kitchener. His standing claim was never verified, and Nickell notes that Bierce's daughter denied ever having received such a letter. As for Nickel and Neal, both concluded that Bierce likely committed suicide. Neal compiles numerous sources as to Bierce's state of mind and concluded that he simply did not want to deal with the infirmity of age. Neal speculates that the trip to Mexico was simple misdirection and that Bierce most likely killed himself at a spot in Arizona's Grand Canyon. Millard, however, also a personal friend of Bierce, disagrees. I knew the man well. He was a fatalist and did not believe in assisting fate. Of course, there's one further possibility. In the 1922 article in the Elkhorn newspaper, a childhood friend is quoted as saying, I wouldn't be surprised if he was still alive. Brose was that sort of chap. You never knew what he was going to do. He did so many things that surprised us that it wouldn't marvel much if he showed up someday. In Bierce's 1893 short story, Charles Ashmore's Trail, a young man is sent to fetch a pail of water, and when he doesn't return, his family goes to search for him. They find his tracks in the snow, but they simply, mysteriously stop. The morning light showed nothing more. Smooth, spotless, absolutely unbroken. The shallow snow lay everywhere. Ambrose Bierce's trail seems to be much the same. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community and locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.